deepfakes are really kind of like a wide-scale war on women, as I've come to see it. And with looking at how Grok was being weaponized, this is a way for misogynists to be able to control and punish women who they otherwise would not have access to.
Hello and welcome to Tech Won't Save Us, made in partnership with The Nation magazine. I'm your host, Marx, and this week my guest is Kat Tenbarge. Kat is an independent journalist who writes the Spitfire News newsletter. You were probably just as enraged as I was to see what was going on Elon Musk's X platform over the past month or so, where the safeguards were rolled back on the Grok chatbot to allow it to generate non-consensual explicit deepfakes of virtually anybody, men, women, but also even children, and how shockingly bad the response was to what was going on. You know, you essentially have a platform here that was already turned into this kind of right-wing space because of the way that Elon Musk has governed it and has changed the way that algorithmic amplification works and, you know, the user base of the platform overall. But then you have him wanting even more engagement and seeing that playing into the perverts and the misogynists who are on the platform and who are big fans of his could use this image generator in ways that are truly shocking and really to get away with it, right? You know, he received this pressure from various governments who were not happy with what was happening, but very few of them actually moved forward to practical actions to protect their citizens who were being victimized in the moment, just continued to allow this to happen and talked about, you know, maybe having repercussions or doing investigations or that sort of a thing. It was really terrible to see just how little our government seemed to be able to act against Elon Musk and this platform he owns, even when it goes so far as not just to create non-consensual images of, you know, women and men, of adults, but even of children, which is something that is so clearly illegal. And so naturally, I felt we had to do an episode on this, and I could think of no better guest to come on to talk about what happened and the implications of it than Kat. She has been reporting on deepfakes, on AI-generated explicit images for quite a long time now. And of course, not only had the kind of background context that was necessary as this scandal broke out, but was obviously just as enraged about it as all the rest of us. So with that said, I think we should just get into this conversation with Kat. I hope you enjoy it and, you know, it's not too shocking for you. If you do like this conversation, you can leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. You can share the show on social media or with any friends or colleagues who you think would learn from it. And if you do want to support the work that goes into making Tech Won't Save Us every single week, so we can keep having these critical, in-depth conversations, looking at the ways that Elon Musk and so many other of these tech billionaires are making the world a worse place every single day, you can join supporters like Pranshu from India, Shivam from Toronto, and Jordan in Denver, Colorado by going to patreon.com/techwon'tsave us, where you can become a supporter as well. Thanks so much and enjoy this week's conversation. Kat, welcome back to Tech Won't Save Us.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Absolutely. Really excited to chat. Unfortunately, it seems, you know, I have you on to talk about probably the worst possible topics that we can talk about.
That is where my coverage always goes.
Yeah. At least you're doing the hard work of looking into this for people and making sure they're informed. What I wanted to have you back on the show to talk about was what we have been seeing play out with Elon Musk's X platform and the Grok chatbot over the past number of weeks, where, you know, we have basically had the platform take these restrictions off of the chatbot to allow it or make it much easier to generate non-consensual explicit images, not just of women and adults, but of children as well. Obviously, there has been a whole firestorm around this. And so I want to dig into a ton of aspects of this with you. But I think just generally, as you were seeing this story break in late December, early January, what was your initial reaction to this? Were you surprised, or did it just seem like a matter of time before something like this happened?
I definitely wasn't surprised, but it did remind me sort of, as I've covered deepfakes over the past few years, there are like these cultural moments that are just like these peak points when things are really starting to shift and you just see this like massive influx of typically image-based sexual abuse like produced with AI. And that's exactly what this was. And the way that the pattern always has gone, at least that I've observed, is like there will be this thing that seems so insignificant. In this case, it was a viral tweet that basically said like, I looked at Grok's image output and I saw that it was being used to undress pictures of women and girls. And that one post, got enough traction that other people went and started seeing that this was happening. And then the outrage started to foment and grow and grow and grow. And unfortunately, as we always see, alongside like the awareness that this is happening, the growth just accelerates and skyrockets to an unbelievable degree. So now that the numbers are in over the past month, we can see that this was, again, another major tipping point with just like a library that you can hardly quantify or imagine or wrap your head around in terms of how many of these images were produced and how many people were victimized.
Absolutely. Like, I think there was a New York Times report just today as we're talking that put it in the millions, right, of the number of images generated just over the course of like a couple weeks at the peak period where this was really happening, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I found it interesting what you said there about the tweet going viral, because it did really seem like the restrictions were taken off of the Grok chatbot, rolled back. And it did seem like it took like a few days to a week or so for people to really realize what was happening and to start like reckoning with what, the X platform, what Elon Musk, what his team had really unleashed here, right?
100%. And it's like so unfortunate that you can see almost exactly how this happened, because the potential for this to happen has been there, and sort of this practice has been happening now for years. But what was really different about this moment, and with the X platform specifically, is that Elon Musk and the team behind XAI, with him as its like prominent, very public facing face, they encouraged this cultural shift on the platform by rolling out all of these like sexy, flirty, spicy NSFW functions. And Elon himself obviously has a really misogynistic attitude toward women in general, toward marginalized people.
Yeah, really putting it lightly, even.
Yeah,
Just saying that.
exactly. Exactly. Like, looking at Elon Musk, there's no question why so many men on the platform who look up to him and idolize him were inspired to create this type of content. And so it was kind of happening quietly in the background as they rolled out these features. And then, of course, in the new year, all it took was someone with a large following spotting it happening for everyone to realize this is now happening. And then, of course, it inspires more and more and more of that behavior.
Which is, not surprising, but also like disgusting and abhorrent at the same time. Can you talk to us a bit about how this actually works? Like, what were we actually seeing occur on this platform?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the most common sort of frequent phenomenon that was happening is people were responding to women's photographs. That could be a woman posting a selfie on X. That could be a user pulling her pictures from some other place on the internet. And they would post it on X and then reply and at Grok and say something like, put her in a bikini, or cover her face in whipped cream, or turn her around. And Grok would often respond and edit the image in that fashion. So the bikini pictures are really what captured the most attention, because that was something that they could get the bot to easily do. What we typically see with user behavior in these cases is that trends will emerge, like specific prompts will create a successful image. They'll result in the user getting what they wanted, which is to humiliate this woman. And so then a bunch of other users will do the same thing. And that's how like the bikini trend emerged. And by the end of the first couple of days when this was proliferating, researchers found that more than 7,700 harmful images of this variety were being created every hour with Grok. And these ranged on a scale, because there were some things that Grok is still doing that don't fall under the range of sexually explicit territory. But then there also was a lot of material that was sexually explicit. I've had researchers send me examples of like nudity, of very realistic looking genitalia. I've seen some pretty shocking stuff on the X platform publicly. And at the same time, what a lot of people don't know is that the standalone Grok app and Grok Imagine, which is like a website, is an app, that was making even more sexually explicit and violent material. So all of Grok in all of its various forms. But what the most viral output was what was happening on X publicly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, and something that I want to come back to, though, right? Because you have what's on the platform, but then you have this much bigger picture that seems to be occurring outside of X itself. And so I want to return to that in just a little bit. But in terms of like looking at what is happening on X and what Grok is able to do on that specific platform, obviously there were concerns about what was happening on the platform well before the end of October and these changes. Can you talk about what was occurring on there before, and to what degree any of this was actually possible before these changes were made?
Yeah. So I started covering deepfakes pretty routinely in early 2023. And by that time, X was already the premier social media platform for deepfakes to get traffic on. So from almost the beginning of this practice becoming mainstream, X was just like a real environment for this to flourish. And what I used to see a lot of was I would search for example, I would search TikTokers' names on the platform, and I would just look at the chronological results of imagery associated with their names, the most recent posts containing images and the words like Addison Rae or Charlie D'Amelio. And I found deepfakes just running rampant. And this was obviously happening in plain sight, but a lot of them weren't viral. It was like this kind of thriving, almost underground community of deepfake proliferation. And it largely seemed to be targeting public figures, which makes sense because when it comes to the community aspect of deepfakes and the monetary aspect of deepfakes, it functions a lot like mainstream pornography, just with no consent. And so women who are already famous, there's a real market and appetite for that content. But as the technology evolves alongside that demand, you start to see people going, I want to make deepfakes of my cousin, or I want to make deepfakes of some girl I'm in class with, or just this random person. And so I saw all of that happening on X over the past few years. And as time went by, the incidents started getting more viral. A lot of people will probably remember at the beginning of 2024, the Taylor Swift deepfake incident, where there were those AI-generated pictures of her in a football field. And that was probably the most massive incident that X was embroiled in, but it was far from the only one. The Taylor Swift stuff, X actually responded. It was too late. The images were already viral and are still proliferating today. But, X made it impossible to search Taylor Swift for a while. They don't do that for the vast majority of people affected. And there was legislation inspired by the Taylor Swift deepfakes, in Congress. Other times I've seen this happen, the response has been much more minimal. One of the most shocking examples of this was in 2024. There was a viral deepfake of the actor Jacob Elordi, and it was not hard to find. It was all over X, and this was Jacob Elordi's face on the body of someone who appeared to be like a porn performer. And these face swap videos, really, really common, really popular phenomenon. What I found was the person who said it was their body in the video, he told me that he was 17 when he took the video. So that was essentially like CSAM, child sexual abuse material, being spread on X as this viral celebrity deepfake. And I remember reaching out to X at the time. They took down some of the posts when I sent them to them. But otherwise, this has never been something that X has really worked to contain. They are more responsive than they are proactive. And their response is often so much less than where it needs to be if they want this to stop happening. So the vibe that I always had, even before Grok, was X doesn't really care if their platform is a rampant space for this type of abusive material. They're not really doing the work to ensure that it isn't. And by the time it goes viral, their attempts at sort of solving the problem do really very, very little to stem those problems.
Yeah, I think really well said. And there's a bunch of things in there in that answer that I want to kind of drill down on a little bit further, right? I want to start with that notion of the safety team, right? And what is actually going on at X itself. We know that when Elon Musk came into Twitter, he kind of gutted a lot of different parts of the company, significantly reduced the headcount at that platform before renaming it X and doing all this. And there was this reporting in CNN about kind of meetings that occurred before these changes to Grok and what it was able to do. And it kind of suggested that there were even a couple people on what remained of the safety team there that even left before these things happened. So what do we know internally about what is going on there and how this platform is actually looking at, the kind of harmful material that can spread on it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, as you said, the manpower to address these issues has just been decimated ever since Elon Musk took over. And that was very intentional and that was very specific. Some of the boards he disbanded and segments of some of the employees who he let go, they were specifically in these roles around things like child safety. So he really took a sledgehammer to any of the infrastructure that could have been around to address this or raise these questions or make sure that this didn't happen in the first place. And then in addition to that, when we look at sort of the priorities of the X team as communicated through their public posts, as communicated through the actions that we see taking place on the platform, safety hasn't just been sort of like minimized as a concern. We're really kind of seeing the opposite play out. Like, we are seeing people at the wheel of X who are embracing the chaos and driving it in this direction. And they're a little more subtle about it than getting out and saying, like, we don't care, it's a CSAM free for all. Like, they're not going to say that. But what we do see them saying is like, we love these depictions of women. We want to see more of this type of stuff. Like, Elon Musk was responding to bikini edits with laughing emojis. He frequently, like daily, is posting these like sensual AI generated images of young looking women made with Grok imagines. So that's like the tone being set on the platform, and the rules and the safety team are following along with that vision.
Yeah, it really is disgusting, right? Like, you have this man who is in his 50s, has all of these children and, different women who he's had children with, and like is regularly posting, yeah, as you were saying earlier, these advertisements for the chatbot that can like have a not safe for work mode and stuff like that. And then these AI generated images of women in like suggestive positions or even with like captions on it that, is, I don't know, I find it kind of disturbing just to see like what he's up to. And then to see like the reaction to this whole moment where he seems to feel like it's a big joke, right?
100%. And it's really interesting and kind of unique, the relationship that the perpetrators of image-based sexual abuse on the platform have to Elon Musk. Like, I have found deepfakes on every major social media platform, and I found tons of bad, real violating content on all of these platforms. And to a degree, like, there's nothing you can do to ensure that nothing bad or harmful is going to get posted on your platform. But one of the major differences is just the level of sort of idolatry when it comes to Elon Musk. I was looking at the accounts of people creating this material, of people prompting Grok to put her in a bikini. And some of them had Elon Musk tweets as their banner. And some of them had like #1 Elon Musk fan in their bio and things like that. And you don't really see that dynamic with someone like Mark Zuckerberg or one of the other tech CEOs. Like, Elon has this cult of personality that he has created very intentionally, and he has weaponized it. And this is a consequence of that.
Yeah, even when you mention Mark Zuckerberg, like, sure, he's made this kind of like manly pivot recently, but I can't see many people being like, yeah, my male icon, like for working out or whatnot, is Mark Zuckerberg. Like, yeah, oh my God. I'm not surprised to hear you say that about these people and the way that they look up to Musk, but it is still like, it still turns my stomach to hear it. You've talked about the way that these people are approaching women, the way that they see women, in a very misogynistic way. And they're getting that kind of passed down from on high, from the platform owner, from the richest man in the world, from this guy who has been held up by all these media institutions and powerful figures for decades, and now is doing all of this with the power that he has accrued. But there's another kind of dimension to this story, especially in the early days, and I don't know how much that was actually addressed later, but how the Grok was also being used to create images of children. And you've mentioned this with the child sexual abuse material, CSAM. Can you talk about that dimension of this and whether that has been properly reined in? Because it felt like the first week there was a lot of attention on this, and then it felt like that really dropped off, and it was more about how this tool was being used against women after that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I thought it was really interesting how the phenomenon kind of grabbed a lot of attention as framing Grok as like a CSAM generating machine, which is not entirely unfair. I found in sort of reviewing the output from Grok at various times throughout this controversy, it's really hard to distinguish sometimes. Like, are you looking at a picture of a child or are you looking at a picture of a grown woman? And I think that a lot of perpetrators purposefully blur those lines, where it's like they oftentimes focus on very young looking women. But absolutely, I mean, just a couple days ago, I was sent an account of this guy who was posting pictures that were absolutely schoolgirls. Like they were school age children, and he was having Grok like turn them around. And this was after X, put in new restrictions. Like this behavior is still happening all over the platform. And I think a lot of times violence against women and girls and women and children is very interlinked because it falls under a lot of the same sort of social patterns and impulses and biases that we recognize in this field of understanding abuse.
It makes me so mad, like to even hear you describe it, right? So I want to ask you about the response to this, as you were saying, when they started to rein things in. But before we do that, I did want to dig a little bit more into the history and the consequences here, right? So you talked about the history of the platform, what we have been seeing since 2023, but more broadly, with explicit deepfakes and non-consensual AI-generated images, obviously this existed before generative AI, but generative AI feels like it has really kind of fueled and given a lot of acceleration to this practice. So can you talk to me about the evolution of this that we've seen over the past number of years?
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that I always try to communicate through my work on AI and image-based sexual abuse and harassment is like the ideas and the ideologies and even a lot of the behaviors at play are not new whatsoever. So there's a legal scholar named Marianne Franks who she has told me in the past that like before AI, one of the ways that people would make this face swap sexually explicit material is they would take physical magazines and they would cut out women's pictures, like celebrity women and girls, and they would physically paste them over like a pornographic magazine. And then they would cut that out and mail it to the celebrity.
No way.
Yes, yes. So this was like the pre-internet, well in advance of AI version of deepfaking. And at the time, the response from, authority figures, from people in these women's lives was like, oh, it's not a big deal. Like, it's not real. Just ignore it. Maybe take it as a compliment even. And we have seen a lot of that sentiment kind of evolve alongside the proliferation of deepfake technology because it isn't really taken seriously. And the vast majority of perpetrators are not held accountable in any way. But the major distinction with deepfake technology and with Grok specifically is looking at sort of like the speed and scale and availability of what is happening. So in the early days of deepfakes, which go all the way back to 2018 and even before, there were already communities on like Reddit making like Scarlett Johansson deepfakes. But at that point in time, it took a lot of sophistication, a lot of tech knowledge, and a lot of time and effort to make a realistic looking deepfake. And even then, the deepfakes still weren't that realistic. Today, the technology has evolved so much that you don't need any technical knowledge whatsoever. All you need to be able to do is at Grok and get the bot to do it for you. So that obviously makes it much more accessible to anyone. It also amplifies the scale at which this is happening. So for example, Genevieve O, the researcher who got a lot of this data for journalists over the past few weeks, she found that Grok was producing like 25 times more material than the top 5 deepfake porn websites combined. So just like that scale is enormous. And we've seen this before. Back when I started reporting on this in 2023, a lot of these deepfake websites were already out there and had been for years. But there were some cultural moments that year where just like the rate of adoption skyrocketed. And when these things skyrocket, they often don't come back down. A lot of times, like once people have figured out how to do it and sort of gotten a taste for it, they will find other ways to go about doing this. So even even if someone can no longer use Grok to do exactly what they want, there are so many other apps out there. Nudifying apps have been, on the app stores for years now. And even like Google and Apple have done a poor job of enforcing rules on apps that do this type of stuff.
I know that they even still run ads for those kinds of apps, like, on Facebook and things like that, right? I've seen reporting on that recently, which is so frustrating, right? It's another one of those things that like adds to the frustration around this whole issue. You talked earlier, and I remember last time you were on the show as well, we were talking about this documentary. I believe it was about a college girl who had deepfakes made of her, and this was like pre-generative AI, right? And was kind of advocating for legislation in order to try to rein these things in. And of course, you mentioned the Taylor Swift moment in early 2024 and how that prompted conversations around legislation and what a legislative response should be. Have we seen anything tangible really come of those efforts in the past?
So it's interesting when it comes to sort of legislation and enforcement around deepfakes. There has been a lot of progress over the past couple of years, and we've seen action taken at the federal level with the Take It Down Act, which is very problematic for a whole host of reasons. We've also seen like different states pass legislation around deepfakes. And from an international perspective, like Australia, the EU, other places have worked to pass measures around deepfakes. The problem really comes in at the enforcement level. And there's really only one example that I am aware of someone posting a deepfake on X and getting in trouble for it. And this is an interesting case. Megan Thee Stallion was targeted with deepfakes back in, I believe, 2024. And she actually sued a woman who had reshared some of these deepfakes and directed her audience to the deepfakes. And she won that defamation lawsuit in recent months. But what's key there is that she knew who the perpetrator was. She knew exactly who this woman was, and therefore she was able to sue her for defamation. And she didn't involve any of these newer statutes created around deepfakes. She went for a more traditional, like reputational harm legal argument. And this situation is so unique because the vast majority of the proliferation of this content is coming from anonymous users who could be based anywhere, who could be disguising where they're based out of. And there's just not prosecutorial effort to go after any of these people. The FBI and the DOJ, thanks to the Take It Down Act, they could be going after people doing this on X right now. They have yet to publicly announce or investigate any of these cases. So my suspicion is that most people who have been targeted over the course of this month by Grok, a lot of them probably don't even know this is happening. Those who do know it's happening don't have a lot of great options. The options that they do have would be very costly, probably prohibitive for the vast majority of people. And to pursue a case like this requires such an enormous toll. You have to popularize the images. You have to think about this for much longer. Like, it's so much energy, expenditure, time, money, all of these different things that you may end up suffering more from trying to get justice than if you just sort of let it go. So that's the unfortunate reality of where we stand with kind of enforcement around these things.
Yeah, I feel like the extent that I have seen of people being held to account, at least like reading news stories and stuff like that, is more like high school kids or whatnot being kind of like disciplined within the school environment rather than like through the legal system for doing this to their peers and things, right? Like, I haven't seen very many actually like legal cases or something where someone actually feels the effects of what they've done, right?
100%. Yeah. And even in those small scale community settings, like an elementary school, the response varies so much depending on what the individual administrators decide to do. There have been some really heartening cases where school administrators have taken it super seriously, expelled perpetrators, like ensured that real consequences happen. But there have been just as many, if not more, examples of school administrators blaming the victim. There was a case recently where a victim actually got expelled after she reported the perpetrators, and there was basically no investigation. The school administrator just assumed that she was lying. So we still see these types of patterns play out at every level. And I think that in itself relates so strongly to gender-based violence in general, whether it's with the use of AI or not.
That's so shocking to hear, but unfortunately, like, not surprising that some cases will be good and other cases you have administrators who like really don't want to do anything positive here, right? You mentioned there like the effects of gender-based violence. And do we know like what the effects of deepfakes, of non-consensual images like this are on the people who, they're created of and kind of weaponized against?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen so many different types of consequences, both at individual levels and at sort of systemic levels. So, at the individual level, there are different risk factors for different victims of this. There have been victims, including very young victims, as well as victims from marginalized communities who have, committed suicide because of this. And sometimes that's because the victim is young, and young people can often be really manipulated into thinking like my life is over. But also in some communities where religious modesty and cultural modesty are really prized, that can be a huge consequence, because even if the material is not quote unquote real, it can have the exact same impact depending on sort of your community norms. And also at the individual level, there's a real psychological consequence at play here. And it's something that applies to a lot of different forms of online harassment, where kind of the common knowledge or assumption is like there's that famous meme, like, how is cyberbullying real? Just close your eyes. And like that kind of stuff is like, it's funny, it's comedic, but the reality is so much darker, because the reality of what we know about online harassment is that our brains perceive these things that happen to us online as physical threats. So when you are being physically threatened online, or when you see a deepfake of yourself, you will have a physical reaction. Your palms will shake, you'll feel scared, your fight or flight response will kick in. You may endure the same consequences of what we would think of as quote unquote real life trauma. It's still real, and your body is like perceiving it as happening to you. So there are a lot of consequences that happen at that level. And then at the more systemic level, I think what's really unfortunate is that through reading like deepfake forums and through poring over sort of what the perpetrators talk about and how they refer to what they're doing, a common thread that has emerged is similar to other forms of patriarchal violence. The sort of end goal here is to punish women at large as a group, make it harder to be a woman, and specifically to sort of push women out of the public eye by like retaliating and making it so dangerous to exist in these online spaces. And we can actually see that happening on X, because so many women have left the platform. I left the platform in response to, gender-based violence on the app when Trump got reelected, when Nick Fuentes was saying like, your body, my choice. That for me was like the breaking point of, I don't want to be here anymore. This environment is psychologically destructive to me as a woman. And a lot of people have left social media because of this. I've seen multiple examples of, high profile women leaving social media because of the Grok trend, because they were victimized by it or because they're scared of it. I've seen so many women say like, I don't post pictures of myself online anymore. I would never let my daughter post pictures of herself online. And that may seem like good safety advice in theory. What that really means is like women aren't living their lives fully or equally in these spaces that are so important, because these are democratic spaces. These are places where we make our voices heard. These are places where we build careers. These are places where we share our perspectives and knowledge and insights with the world. And so deepfakes are really kind of like a wide scale war on women as I've come to see it. And with looking at how Grok was being weaponized, one thing that really struck me was like, this is a way for misogynists to be able to control and punish women who they otherwise would not have access to. Like, it's a way to sort of see that conservative ideology in action at scale.
Really well put. And like, we can have our criticisms of social media and how these platforms work, and what these companies have done to like these spaces where we communicate with one another, but at the same time recognize that like there shouldn't be these kind of structural barriers that are created, that are enabled by people like Elon Musk, that exclude whole swaths of people from these spaces because they don't feel safe to communicate in them, right?
Exactly. It's the digital version of the political project to ultimately undermine women's autonomy, to make it harder to run for office as a woman. It's not a coincidence that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is one of the highest profile victims of deepfaking, and she's also one of the most public forward-facing women in politics. Like, these things are aligned. These sort of like goals and missions are aligned. And I really do think that Elon Musk very intentionally and with full knowledge of what would happen, like introduced these features to the platform.
Definitely. I even think back to like the past few years, right? And how for a while there, a lot of people were really kind of worried and concerned about being open and like admitting the politics that Elon Musk held, right? Like I remember even when he was like, very clearly supporting like abortion bans in Texas, but like wouldn't say it explicitly. People were like, oh, you don't know, maybe he doesn't, like whatnot. But it was like, no, you can tell like he's disowning his trans daughter. He very clearly sees women as, kind of vessels for his procreation. Like, this is not a man that should be given the benefit of the doubt. Yet, even to this day, it feels like with his political positions, that still remains the case, right?
Totally, totally. And a lot of people have sort of defended all of this under the guise of like, it's freedom of speech. It's a freedom of speech issue. And the US government, like federally, has kind of taken this position. And I've seen a lot of like commentators take this position. And the reality is that it is a free speech issue, but the free speech that's being suppressed is the free speech of the women and girls who are being affected by this, as well as women and girls in general as a group, because we're all threatened by the normalization and allowance of this type of behavior.
Yeah, creating non-consensual deepfake images and AI generated images of people is not your free speech. That's not something you have a right to. Like, so I want to ask you about the response to this as well, right? I want to start with the platform itself, right? So it started to get all of this criticism from governments, from, the public generally, I'm sure from a certain segment of users of the X platform as well. How did X and XAI respond as the kind of concern and the scandal around this was escalating?
So the response from the companies, that it was very delayed. There were several days that went by before they really responded to anyone. And meanwhile, the XAI press account responds to every request with an automated response that just says legacy media lies, which is a classic like Elon Musk move.
At least it's not like the poop emoji anymore, but like it's not any better. Yeah.
Exactly. And one thing that people picked up on in the early days of this that was so annoying is there were some legacy media outlets that were asking Grok for comment and then printing it. And
oh
it's
my
like,
God.
oh.
I was going to say, like, there were all of these headlines, right, that were like, Grok says whatever or what, as though like Grok itself was like impersonated, was thinking, was like acting on its own. And it's like, no, there's like Elon Musk and all these little guys turning the dials behind the scenes that is resulting in this, right? It's not like the chatbot itself has any agency here.
Exactly. There's like this huge tech literacy gap around conversational AI where it's like even authority figures treat it like it is a conscious thing that is capable of forming a response. It is reflecting what you ask it. Like when you prompt it to do something, it's just trying to please you by like regurgitating what you said back to you. So that being said, like that was ridiculous to see. And then, X Safety releases a statement a few days afterwards. And they basically say, and Elon Musk says this too, anyone who posts anything illegal to the platform will be treated the same way, regardless if it's AI or not, which was kind of a true statement in that when you post illegal material on X, there is no guarantee or likelihood that anything will happen to you either. Like the platform has become known for videos depicting like extreme violence, extreme gore, things like bestiality, sexual abuse, and of course, the aforementioned deepfakes. So he wasn't lying when he said that they weren't going to treat the content any differently. It's just that they don't do anything about these problems. So that was the initial response. And then the backlash really started to build. And we initially saw this in the form of other governments responding to what was happening on X, like Malaysia and Indonesia were two of the first governments to actually temporarily ban the platform. India also, like a government minister there, took action, launched an investigation. We saw the UK's independent regulatory body start to investigate. The EU, France, California as its own entity started to investigate X. So you saw all of this growing international pressure, mainly coming from other Western governments and Southeast Asian governments. And so alongside that, there's like the growing user backlash, more and more people speaking out about this. And finally, in response to that pressure, and I think specifically that regulatory pressure, like the fear of those fines, the fear of the app being completely blocked in places like the UK. That's when, last week, I believe, is when they said first they restricted the ability to create or to use Grok to edit images to just paying premium users, which didn't stop the problem at all because those paying premium users are often the Musk fanboys who were driving a lot of this behavior.
Exactly. And I even saw like tweets like, when people would do the @Grok and, ask it to undress somebody. I don't know if it still does it, but there was a period of time where it would respond and say like, you can only do this if you're a paying member now. Like basically like an explicit upsell on your attempt to create non-consensual deepfakes. Like, ugh.
Yes, absolutely. And it is still doing that, I'm pretty sure. And so, yeah, they're basically just at that point monetizing the image-based sexual abuse. So that was the first response. And then after more sustained pressure, that's when they announced that they were rolling back the ability for Grok to put real photos of people in revealing clothes. That was kind of the way that they phrased it. And with these efforts put into place, we did see a decrease because at its peak, when anyone could do this to anyone at any time, there were over 7,700 images per hour being created. After the changes, we were still seeing a ton of images. Like we were still seeing thousands of images being created per hour, but there was a decrease. And then after they rolled the restrictions back seemingly entirely, but I'll get into that in a second, when they restricted it even more, we again saw another decrease. But the reality of the situation was, they left a lot of the most harmful material up. So like you can still go back and look at these pictures that were created in the first place. And people very quickly found ways to get around these restrictions. So like the researcher who I've been in communication with, she was immediately able to find numerous examples of really sexually explicit, like bad stuff still being created, really realistic looking like genitalia, bikinis. She still was able to find those, like stuff like the little girls being told to turn around, things like that. That was all still happening. And something that I personally observed as a shift in sort of this culture is an emerging phenomenon that is now really, really rampant, involving like commanding Grok to take off religious items of clothing, like the hijab, or put on religious items of clothing. So now a lot of the prompts that I'm seeing are Grok put her in a sari, like the Indian traditional cultural clothing, or like Grok put her in a nun's habit, or like Grok like cover her up. And it doesn't fall under the same legal definitions of what we think of as sexually explicit because it's literally the opposite. But that impulse and that ideology is the same. So the boundaries have just shifted. And there's this gray area around what they're doing because a lot of what they're doing is still pretty nakedly abusive and harmful, especially like @Grok, take off her hijab and show her with curly hair. I see that all the time. And like that is really harassing, but they know that they can get around sort of the restrictions that have been put in place. And the root of this behavior is obviously the desire to control women, to take away their autonomy. And, it's a very sexist sort of ideology at play.
Yeah. And I feel like that example just like adds to what you're saying as well, right? Where it's like, okay, it's not even just about taking the clothes off of all these women. It's like, even just changing them, putting, again, taking a hijab off when that's part of like your cultural or religious identity can still be like very invasive and very abusive and things like that. It just makes me so mad to hear about all these things. I want to ask you as well about like the media response, right? Because we talked about how some of these headlines were reporting on Grok talking about this in a certain way, but I also felt that as X was announcing these changes to the platform and how it was going to work, we very quickly got these headlines like, oh, the platform is reining this in, they're taking action to address this. And then, as you're saying, when researchers or journalists, certain journalists started digging into what was actually happening, they quickly found that it doesn't sound exactly like what X suggested. These things can still happen, or they're just monetizing it. I wonder what you make of, I guess, the way that the media reported on this and how it wasn't always completely accurate or reflective of what was actually happening in a case that was important to give the public accurate information here, right?
100%. And I think that over the past few decades, we've seen some advances in how the media often covers gender-based violence. one thing that I compare it to, just to show how stark that difference can be, is when what we call oftentimes revenge porn, colloquially, when that started to become a really viral phenomenon in the late 2000s and the 2010s, a lot of the media framing is that it was the victim's fault for taking these photos in the first place. And like, if you think back to how the media treated like prominent celebrity women who experienced that, tonally, it was extremely like victim blamey. And today things have gotten a little bit better, but as you're describing here, there is still way too much of a reliance on sort of like the authority figures in the equation. And we see that with media coverage in lots of different respects. You see it with how the media gives the police so much authority when they cover crime. You can see it in how the media gives like the federal government so much authority when they cover politics. And you can see it in how media companies give tech companies the benefit of the doubt when we cover these patterns of abuses. And the reality is, just because the tech company says that it is fixing the problem, as we should all know by now, that does not mean they are fixing the problem. And in fact, a lot of these tech companies, when AI was starting to evolve into what we think of it as now, when that was happening a few years back, a lot of these companies signed on to pledges around non-consensual intimate imagery, where they pledged and promised that they would do everything in their power to stop this from becoming the crisis that it is today. And all the media outlets wrote that up feverishly. Like, all these, they're doing a great job, everyone. They're doing a great job. They are not doing a great job. And yet still we return to this idea that when Elon Musk and his company say they are doing something, that means it can be reported on as fact. And I wish that as an industry, we would stop taking these guys at their word when they've proven over and over and over again that we're foolish to do so.
Yeah, it even makes me think of like whenever Elon Musk says something that sounds like any bit like sci-fi, that gets written up as like headlines. Elon Musk says this is coming, whatever. But when he posts like white nationalist tweets and whatnot, that doesn't get the same degree of coverage and attention as the nice like science fiction is really coming. But as you say that too, like it even makes me think of how early after the Twitter acquisition, Elon Musk was talking a lot about taking on child sexual abuse material. Like I can't remember the exact language that he was using in that moment, even as researchers were saying this is proliferating on the platform. And now, of course, we've seen his AI chatbot actually create child sexual abuse material images. Just like boggles the mind how there's not more accountability on this man for what he's doing, right?
100%. And it is so reminiscent of how child safety and protecting children and stopping child trafficking and child abuse and all these other things, it is so frequently like a pillar of conservative rhetoric around like, this is why we need ICE. This is why we're doing all of these things. But the reality is it's a total displacement of responsibility. And it's essentially just like a bait and switch, because the reality is that these authorities are often the ones perpetuating the problem and letting it happen. They just use that rhetoric to gain more popularity and to get themselves into these positions of power.
Definitely. And so I wanted to ask you about the government response, right? You mentioned in particular seeing the South Asian and Southeast Asian governments moving really quickly to try to rein this in or even to temporarily ban the platform. We heard a lot of kind of talk from European governments, but at least at this point, as we talk, it doesn't seem to have amounted to much in terms of like enforcement or anything. So I wonder what you make of how they've responded to this and what you think we really should be seeing as governments see this happening, as we see this AI-generated kind of deepfake crisis continually seemingly getting worse, and it doesn't feel like they're doing enough. Like, what do you think they should be doing here, and what are we actually seeing them doing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting distinction, because it's not bad that these governments, made these threatening statements, that they rushed to investigate, that they called this out as wrong. In theory, and even in practice to some extent, that was a good thing. And I do think that that sort of sustained international pressure is a huge reason why X did anything at all. If it weren't for those countries, I imagine that Grok would still be doing exactly what Grok was doing a month ago. But I think when you look closer at sort of the underlying reasoning behind a lot of these government responses, and also sort of the structure of a lot of legislation here in the US too, one of the issues is that the focus is so frequently on the obscenity component. And the focus here oftentimes is like, well, this is bad because it's sexually explicit, or this is bad because it's pornographic. And so therefore it becomes a very narrow definition of what exactly is bad and what exactly these governments care about stopping. And so that is how we wind up in the situation where we are now, where they have removed or at least limited the ability to put someone in a bikini or to create public graphic nudity. But meanwhile, behind closed doors, if you have the Grok app, you can still do all of that stuff and worse. And even publicly, we've just seen it shift to, put her in a hijab or take her hijab off. And because that doesn't fall under the boundaries of what's considered sexually explicit or what's considered pornographic or obscene, you're not going to see the same government response. And so, a lot of the scholars and advocates who I've spoken to about this have argued that we really need to sort of change how we think about these issues. The problem isn't that all nudity is bad. And in fact, like that line of thinking will often carry into censorship and often carry into like threats to freedom of expression and, censorship and discrimination against sex workers and things like that. The reality is that the problem is the desire to control women. And that is something that our sort of like legal field does not have like the language for yet, or does not have like the desire to put in our existing framework of right and wrong. And so I think that will require a much bigger cultural shift to understand that the root of the problem is not just like the nudifying aspect of this, but that it's like the control aspect of this. And it's the misogynistic aspect of this. And that is really like the root of this and associated behaviors, not just like the sexually explicit function. But because that is where so much of like the government focus is, you see things like the Take It Down Act, which the Take It Down Act is not working as intended. The Take It Down Act was supposed to ensure that something like this wouldn't happen, and that if it did happen, you would see this prosecution at the highest level. We're not getting that prosecution. What a lot of people fear is going to happen with the Take It Down Act is that in just a few months, in May of this year, the second half of that legislation is going to come into effect. Platforms like X and also all the other major social media platforms are supposed to create these flag and removal systems where you or anyone can say like, here's a deepfake of me, take it down. And they have 48 hours to do that. But the problem with these incoming systems is that they could so easily be weaponized and used for censorship and used for anything, because platforms don't actually have time to look at every single thing that's going to get flagged. A lot of them, as we already know, are going to operate with an overabundance of caution. And when Trump signed the Take It Down Act into law, he pointed out Linda Yaccarino, who was then the CEO of X and was then in the audience. And he said, like, Linda and X, they're doing such a great job. What?
Right. Okay.
and then and then the other thing he said was like, this is so great for me because no one's treated worse than I am on the internet. So it's very clear how this could become a tool of federal censorship versus what it was supposed to do, which is help victims. But this White House administration is obviously not focused on anything to help victims of sexual violence.
Well, they're focused on the biggest victim of all, right? Donald Trump. He's the victim.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh my God. As you were describing that though, like I was immediately and like, the cultural differences and like the issues with nudity generally, or even just sexual content, it brought me back to like the early days of the App Store and how Steve Jobs was like, we can't have apps that have like nudity or anything like that. Like, we're not going to allow it on the App Store. And like the Europeans were like, but we don't have a problem with that. Like, why are you sticking your kind of cultural norms onto us and like the rest of the world? Because this makes no sense, right? So you can totally see how those views definitely shape legislation, especially in the United States, and then how that can like filter out to other places as it's like normalized in that market, in like the major market of the internet and whatnot, and then gets adopted elsewhere. I feel like one of the points that angered me or that really stood out to me is like, listen, I guess people can debate about when this is being done to adults. And I think both of, you and I would be on the side of like, this is not acceptable when it's done to adults because it takes away power, it takes away agency. There should be accountability for something like this. But there are like clear laws about this being done to children and about this kind of material being created of children. And I found it really shocking that there was not a stronger response, at least on that side of things, and how quickly that seemed to fade from the discussion. And I wonder what you make of that.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I've even interviewed a legal scholar who made the argument that this has been illegal since the 90s, because back in the late 90s, there were laws passed around how children could be depicted in CGI and sort of how that applied to CSAM and sort of like fake but realistic looking content. So this has been illegal and prosecutable for a very, very, very long time. But the reality is that it rarely is taken seriously and followed through. And in sort of my experience reporting on gender-based violence at large, that doesn't surprise me because I've seen this time and time again where like it falls to the FBI, it falls to local police, it falls to people in these varying jurisdictions, and it just doesn't get done. Like the cases just get dropped, things do not get followed up on. I think what's even concerning here is sort of this idea that because the problem is so pervasive, because there are a million of these images out there, like we're not even going to try. We're not even going to instill the pretense that we're going to go after this type of behavior, whether it's illegal or not. And I think that is really discouraging for anyone sort of in this field. But it also sort of speaks to the way that rhetoric around caring about children is so easily weaponized, even when the people behind that rhetoric have no intention of following it through. And right now, one of the major conversations happening is around children and online safety. And we have so much legislative momentum in the US, but also all around the world saying like, we got to take kids off the internet, like kids shouldn't be allowed on the internet. That's how we're going to keep kids safe. When the reality is that as adults, we can't keep kids safe on the internet. Like, even if kids aren't allowed to use X, what we have here as a problem is that adults are posting their pictures and like there's nobody doing anything about that. So I think that a lot of times when we look at the discourse politically and culturally and otherwise around children and safety in the internet, it's like we kind of have our targets all wrong. It's not that the kids are posing a danger to themselves necessarily. It's more so that as adults, we have yet to figure out a way to hold each other accountable for hurting children. And that's going to be a problem with AI. It's already such a pervasive problem in every respect.
I think that this is such a good example, like this whole kind of like scandal, right? Around how, okay, listen, you can have a debate around raising an age limit on what social media should be or whatnot, but it shows very clearly that the problem isn't the age that you go onto social media or these platforms, but the broader way that we have allowed these companies to create these platforms and govern these platforms. And it feels like we need much more of like a rule book or like expectations and standards on how those platforms should operate to make sure that we reduce the potential for harm for everybody, adult or child alike, rather than being like, okay, you're not a certain age, so you can't use it, but everyone else can still like be abused or have mental health impacts or whatever it is we want to talk about, because we're not going to pay attention to how the platform operates in any other context, right?
100%. And to me, this has so many parallels to the Epstein story as well, which was a case involving a lot of victims who were underage, as well as a lot of victims who were adults. And now that the child victims are adults and still continuing to advocate for themselves, they're still not being taken seriously. Like, you see how this is a problem that is not just constrained by technology, but rather is like a much further reaching, pervasive, like cultural attitude. And the lack of follow up with Grok is then reflected in all of these other prominent cases.
A really great point. I have a couple final questions for you before we wrap up. The first is that, okay, we've been talking a lot about Grok, right? We've been talking about a lot about what has been happening on the X platform, or even what you can do with Grok, outside of X. And obviously what happens on X is important because of the virality component, right? Because it can really take off. A lot of people can see it. But we know that there is this kind of much bigger network of generative AI tools, open source models that are used for different things and what have you, that are also used to victimize people, to victimize women in particular, but also children, because of the lack of guardrails here. Do you have any idea of what we can actually do to try to tackle this much bigger issue just beyond, this one social media platform and the chatbot that's attached to it?
It's such a great question. And I think that a lot of times I'm more scared of what we're not seeing than what we are actually seeing, because it's so much harder to even get a grasp of what's happening behind the scenes with these essentially like closed door platforms. The Grok app, that it applies to that, but it also applies to all of these other technologies, all these other applications. And so I think within sort of the evolution of AI, in order to create products that are actually safe for consumer use and don't perpetuate these problems, the act of like resisting and opposing sexual abuse has to be an active consideration throughout the entire process, because it starts with sort of the programming and the data sets on which these AI technologies are trained on. Researchers at, I believe, Stanford found that in popular data sets, there were authentic images of CSAM that AI tools were being trained on. So it is baked in at that level. And I think a lot of people have sort of figured this out through casual use. Like AI depictions of women, they tend to be white, they tend to be young, they tend to be conventionally attractive, and they tend to be sexual or sensual. And so that is a very clear bias in a lot of these AI technologies. And that can't be solved on just the user end. It has to start on the end of the people who are creating and producing these tools. And so I think like that's something that has to be addressed in this industry in order for any of this to get better. And in my experience reporting on sort of AI consumer products and how they've been adopted and what this looks like, I find that the industry is pretty rotten when it comes to this issue. Like you look at some of the earliest iterations of this technology and the earliest applications of this technology, and it's like sexual abuse is so baked in. You go back to 2018 and those videos of Scarlett Johansson, and it's like before ChatGPT, before OpenAI, before any of this stuff reached the mainstream on this massive scale, this was already what it was being used for. And that's a story that's been echoed repeatedly throughout the tech industry's history. We've seen it time and time and time again. So right now, all of the incentives are the opposite of what they need to be. We need like a complete reversal and to kind of like, I would argue, like destroy and rebuild in order to actually get better.
Listen, I'll completely agree with you on that one. I love that idea. But like, even as you're saying that, like it brought to mind, I think it was the end of last year when Sam Altman was basically like open about the fact that they are going to push more of like the app as a companion and like the kind of AI girlfriend kind of stuff, because they recognize that that application got a lot more engagement regardless of the broader consequences that might come with it. As we end off this conversation, I know that you wrote a piece recently about getting off of X and not using that platform anymore. So I wanted to end, with everything that we've been seeing with the deepfake scandal, but also everything before. Do you think people should be getting off this platform and abandoning Elon Musk's social media?
I would love if more people would take that leap. I think at this stage, I mean, it's something that I think about all the time. And it was a very personal decision for me where I just like reached a moment where physically, individually, I was like, oh my God, I can't take it anymore. Because I honestly didn't expect to leave X. I thought of myself as like a long hauler who was like, you're not going to take my platform away from me, Elon Musk.
I remember when he took it over, I was like, I'll be here until it dies. And then that changed. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think at this stage, it's just like the whole platform has been essentially murdered and then reincarnated as like the worst possible version of itself. So I know for me as an individual, like there's no place for me on there. And I still spend a lot of time on the platform as a reporter. So in some ways that almost feels like cheating because I'm like, oh, I can still see all like the good jokes, but but I'm not actually using it, or at least I'm not like contributing to it. But I can see for other people why this is a very fraught decision. I have heard a lot of stories from a lot of people about like why they keep using X, and I can really relate to that and understand that. Like one reason that I've heard is because there are people who have built support networks on X who get support for like just everyday necessities. They have a community there that helps them get through affording life. Or perhaps like that is where their business is located. That's something that I hear from content creators a lot is like they feel like they can't leave because it's still such an important tool and platform for them. And ideally, they wouldn't have to leave. Like this is a platform that has been co-opted and really like made worse for them in a lot of ways. And that's why also, even if I'm not still on X, I find it so important to continue reporting on X, because there are people who really kind of feel like they're stuck there and that their experience is being degraded and it's really being turned against them. Like, again, going back to content creators and sex workers in particular, it's like they are sort of forced to live within the confines of this platform, and the platform is becoming more and more violent toward them. So like they deserve better. And so I do think that a lot of people, I would encourage more people to get off X, because I think at the end of the day, like the complaints about Blue Sky are like, oh, there's not as much stuff over there. Like, where am I going to get my discourse about heated rivalry? And I'm like, well, if you posted it over there, then it would be over there. And yeah, so I would encourage more people to try out the alternatives, because X is unique in its current positioning as like an enemy force. Like, it is the only social media platform that has been directly conjoined with Trump's administration, where like it is an agent of the federal government. So I'm like, this makes it like uniquely bad, but I know why people struggle with it.
Totally. As much as I like recognize and accept the reasons that you gave for why people still might be on there, still because I occasionally pop back on to see if I need to see like what some politician has posted or something like that, and see the number of people who are still engaged on it, I have a harder time kind of like understanding why you would still be over there. It's like, come on, at some point and I felt like, especially seeing this latest scandal, it's like, how can you still be on like the child porn generating platform?
Totally. And one thing that I really wish would happen is I wish that these politicians would get off X. What's so wild about that is they're not even getting any engagement. For one of my Grok stories, I reached out to all of the representatives who co-sponsored the Take It Down Act and the Kids Online Safety Act and some of these other bills, and they are all posting on X every single day. Some of them are getting 0 likes. I'm like, what? Why are you there? Just get off. It serves no value to you. It's bizarre to me. So I do think that a lot of people in positions of power like have no excuse to be on X anymore.
Totally. And government accounts and stuff like that too, right? You see like next to no engagement in like local government and even some like state or provincial government accounts. It's like, okay, this needs to change. This needs to be like the moment where you all start to evacuate from X. Kat, it's always great to get your insights. This was so informative. Thank you so much for taking the time. And of course, I'd highly recommend people go check out Spitfire, where, you know, you're constantly writing really informative stories about these issues and so much more. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Kat Tenbarge is an independent journalist who writes the Spitfire News newsletter. Tech Won't Save Us is made in partnership with The Nation magazine and is hosted by me, Paris Marx. Production is by Kyla Hewson. Tech Won't Save Us relies on the support of listeners like you to keep providing critical perspectives on the tech industry. You can join hundreds of other supporters by going to patreon.com/techwon'tsaveus and making a pledge of your own. Thanks for listening, and make sure to come back next week.